This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Created equal.
This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and with me in the studio is Kerry Jr. II. He is our show's producer.
Good morning, Stephen.
Hey, Kerry.
Yeah.
How closely did you watch the budget talks last week? And in particular, were you up till 3 or 4 in the morning watching what happened on the last day before they got it approved?
No, I didn't know you could watch that live. Were you watching that live, Stephen?
You can't really watch it live, but you can follow on social media these days. And there was a lot going on. I was not up all night, but I was up pretty late because I was pretty interested in what they would get done and what would be in the final budget they approved.
Yeah, I know a couple months ago we had Monique Stanton on to talk about the proposed budget that was about $80-some billion worth. This one, the final budget's around 82.5, I believe it is, billion dollars. So a little bit of an increase. Curious to know what changed, what did Whitmer propose that she did get, what didn't she get? Was there anything in particular that you were looking at that you wanted to see whether or not she'd get it through? Or,
well, I mean, as you said, we had Monique Stanton here to talk about the budget a few months ago. She is the executive director of the Michigan League for Public Policy, which has been really focused on what the governor and the legislature will do to expand economic opportunity, right? And her take was that the proposed budget would do a lot. It would change really the way that the state thinks about opportunity and kind of connects efforts by different parts of Michigan government to provide that kind of opportunity. In the final analysis, the legislature gets the final say here and decides how all of that is going to come together. I think that there were some wins for sure, some things that they got done that Governor Whitmer had asked them to do in that regard. There were some other things that got left off, of course.
Yeah.
What's interesting here is that, Democrats have complete control,
right.
At least in name, in Lansing right now. They have majorities in both chambers of the legislature, and, of course, Governor Whitmer is a Democrat. I think some people assume that means they can get whatever they want, but it's always more complicated than that, and that's why they were up till 4 last week
and I
trying to get it done.
One of the contentious points of why it took so long was trying to get this education figured out, right? And for me, that's what I'm kind of looking to seeing what our guests have to speak to because of this the COVID relief cliff. They had that ESSER bill, which was the elementary and secondary school relief fund. That's going to be, you have to spend all the money by September this year. So school districts are having to reallocate their funds, and there could be potential staff layoffs. So I wanted to see what they had in this bill and this new budget that could accommodate for that potential adjustment that these districts had to make. And our guest today will have something to say about education, economic opportunity, all that stuff.
Yeah. And so we've got Alethia Kasben with us. She is the managing editor at Gongwer. And also with us will be Colin Jackson, who is a reporter at Michigan Public Radio Network. We'll also want to hear from listeners. How close attention did you pay to the budget process last week? And what do you think about what the legislature and the governor have decided to do with $82 billion in public money? Alethia Kasben, always great to have you here with us on Created Equal. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Stephen. Excited to be here today.
Colin Jackson, always great to have you here as well. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Okay, I want to start with the politics here and kind of an overview of what we saw last week as legislators did get a budget done. Generally, we expect that to be done by July 1st, and they made it. I was not sure they were going to make it this year. I thought maybe it might go a little longer, but they did get it done. They were up pretty late on the last day that they were talking about it. Let's talk about why it took as long as it did, and I guess what some of the tensions were about how to spend this $82 billion, especially given that, as I said in the open, Democrats have at least nominal control of everything. The governor's a Democrat, and both houses of the legislature have Democratic majorities. What was it that they were wrangling over all night last week? Alethia, I'll start with you.
So, I mean, the biggest issue with this budget was this school proposal. As we all know, the Democrats had this plan to put less money into the teacher retirement sort of healthcare fund.
Mm-hmm.
That is fully funded. They wanted to put less money there and use it somewhere else in the K through 12 budget. Schools didn't really like this, and there was headbutting over this. So the end plan still puts less money into the retirement fund, but sends it to schools. So schools pay less out of their payroll into this fund, but they don't get a per pupil funding increase as they traditionally do for the first time in about 10 years, I believe. So this really just had everyone up in arms, and this was fighting among friends, right? I mean, these groups are traditionally Democratic allies, and they did not like that they weren't getting a per pupil increase, and they were pushing hard for Democrats to vote no on this, which is part of the reason that we sat around for 8 or so hours waiting until after midnight to first see the budget, and then almost 5 for final passage.
Yeah. So Alethia, can you explain just a little more about that tension between essentially legacy costs in education and the costs of running schools every day? That's something that's not new in Lansing. We've been having this discussion for an awfully long time.
Right. I think schools have been, like you said, schools have been talking about this for forever, right? I mean, even a per pupil increase, they'll come back and say, we still have money that we have to put towards these costs that kind of cut away from what actually goes into the classroom. So essentially what they were asking for was sort of a break because this fund is fully funded. So they want to put less toward it. Their argument is we've paid more. We had to sacrifice, teachers had to sacrifice to pay more into this fund. That is why it's fully funded. We want to pay less, but we also still want, our traditional foundation allowance increase that every school gets a certain amount of money per student that attends that school. And that is what sort of funds the main operations of a classroom.
Yeah. Colin Jackson, I wonder what you had your eye on last week as lawmakers stayed up basically all night trying to figure out not only the school budget but everything else that went into the $82 billion that they plan to spend.
Yeah, to that point, what Alethia was saying, one of the biggest things was still how this budget was going to go. I mean, obviously, the MIPSers, the school, the teachers' retirement system, those discussions were headlines. But some of the stuff that I thought was to the side was some of these bills that were going to be passed before legislators went on the summer break. It's not likely that they're going to do a lot of action before Election Day. So we did see some action on, a range of bills, whether it's kind of some legislation to rein in to strengthen Michigan's laws against ticket bots, a bill that would allow medically frail prisoners better chances at parole. There was a lot of different things kind of that were hanging out there that I think eventually did get acted on. There was also even kind of like the smaller things that you saw were priorities, but hadn't really been prioritized in the same way. Like, for example, Democratic Representative Lori Pohutsky had a bill that would ban the gay panic defense here in Michigan. That's the defense that would say a defendant, that would prevent lawyers from claiming their defendant was sent into some sort of frenzy or some sort of state of reduced mental capacity because they found out the victim's sexuality or perceived sexuality or something like that. So it was kind of like a lot of like odds and ends that the legislature was tying up that I was curious to see what would happen.
Yeah. And all of these things kind of appear at the last minute, it seems, each year. I mean, the legislature spends months and months and months talking about some things, but not talking about others. And then as we get closer to that deadline, that July 1st deadline, if they plan to make it, there's this kind of frantic effort, I guess, to throw all kinds of stuff in and get it approved.
Exactly. And you saw some of these last minute efforts also fall short. For example, there was some discussions over Michigan's economic development programs. The Senate had passed a package a few months ago to reform what's currently known as the SOAR program. That stands for Strategic Outreach and Attraction Reserve, and would transform it to the Make It in Michigan Fund. And the goal of the Senate package would be to divert more of that money that had traditionally been used for providing these businesses like General Motors or Ford with a large amount of money to build, for example, battery plants. The Senate package would have transformed that so it would go to more toward the community infrastructure like public transportation, et cetera. And we saw the House pass its own version of that, or the House consider its own version of that bill package. Notably, in the House, the legislation ran into some opposition from a couple Democratic lawmakers who wanted to see less money going toward business incentives and more money going toward the communities who would be hosting these economic development projects. And that was among the things that lawmakers couldn't get across the finish line.
Yeah. I should also note that WDET was the beneficiary of some of this wrangling in Lansing last week. The station received $1 million in this budget as an enhancement grant. So lots of things got funded at the last second there. Okay, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to dive a little deeper into how this new budget expands opportunity. How does it deal with children? How does it deal with poverty in the state of Michigan? Those were two things that Governor Gretchen Whitmer really highlighted during her spring budget address. What did the legislature end up doing with it? We also want to get going with you, the listeners, on the phones and on social. Give us a call. Let us know how much attention you pay to the state budget each year. What did you think of what lawmakers did last week, trying to meet that July 1st deadline to approve the governor's proposed budget? Were there things in there that jumped out at you? Is the overall approach interesting to you for some reason? 313-577-1019 is the number here on the phones. That's 313-577-1019. You can also go to Twitter and hashtag Created Equal or at WDET. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and we've got Alethia Kasben with us. She's the managing editor at Gongwer News, as well as Colin Jackson, who is a reporter at Michigan Public Radio Network. We're talking about the passage of the state budget for the next fiscal year. It happened last week during a all-night session in Lansing among legislators, hashing out what they would like to spend $82 billion on. We're talking about what we can learn about inequality and opportunity in Michigan based on what legislators decided. We want to hear from you as well about the budget. How much attention did you pay last week to lawmakers pulling an all-nighter, essentially, to make sure that they got the budget done by July 1st? Were there things in it that you thought made a lot of sense? Were there things in it that you think lift up vulnerable populations here in the state of Michigan? What did you make of the decisions that were made late in the night? 313-577-1019, 313-577-1019. That's the number here on the phones. You can also go to Twitter and hashtag Created Equal or at WDET. Okay, I want to dive a little more into some things that we were expecting, I guess, to be in the state budget, or there was a possibility that they would be in the state budget that we didn't quite get. Paid family leave. That's an issue that has come up several times in the past in Lansing. We've been talking about it for a while. I think some people thought this might be the year where we would get that kind of relief for people. We didn't see it in this budget. Colin Jackson, I'll start with you. What happened to that proposal?
It didn't get done simply enough. This is something that had been a priority for Democrats that we have seen talked about. But at the end of the day, when it comes to budgets, there's always going to be bargaining chips. There's going to be things that go by the wayside, and this was one of them.
Yeah. Alethia, Kasben, this was something that a lot of groups in the state were hoping would come together this year. Talk about where we are with that issue and why we're having such a hard time with it.
There's a lot of tension around that issue. I think we hear Democratic leaders generally support it, right? I mean, you talk to the House Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, and they're generally open to this idea. Paid family leave is a popular Democratic idea, but it comes down to the details and it comes down to the money, right? And we haven't really heard any serious public discussion. We haven't had a committee hearing. We haven't seen an analysis on cost or how it would be structured. So this really hasn't been given any serious airtime other than to say, like, this would be a good idea. Maybe Michigan should do it. I wouldn't say it is necessarily dead, but I would think if this was going to happen, it would be more of a lame duck December 2024 proposal. Mm-hmm. But there's a good chance it could not happen at all. I mean, business groups really don't like this. They don't like the idea of paying more. This idea of sort of structuring this like a new sort of tax, kind of like unemployment. They're really opposed. So there's going to be fierce opposition to this if it ever gets serious consideration. And that'll make, Democrats a little nervous too.
Yeah. What about pre-K? There was no universal pre-K that got passed in Lansing this time, but we did see some changes to eligibility and the participation requirement. That's another issue that we've been talking about for quite some time, and there are, of course, places that have universal pre-K. We're not one of them. Alethia, what's going on there?
Yeah, so universal pre-K, they upped the income threshold. So it was 300% of the poverty level. They upped it to 400% of the poverty level, which is about $120,000 for a family of four. Democrats say this will cover a lot of families that need this and bring 5,000 more kids into the system. While they didn't do universal pre-K, there was a secondary income threshold. So basically, once all the slots are filled, if you make 100% more, so maybe 500% of the income level, you could then come into the program. They got rid of that. So now, if a program is serving everyone under the 400% income threshold, anyone else can come in if they have room. So it's not universal pre-K, but it is maybe a step and a half toward it versus, just a step or half a step. Yeah. So they're certainly making strides in that direction. The concern among Democratic lawmakers is the infrastructure there. They don't want to open up universal pre-K and then there's not enough teachers, there's not enough classrooms. So someone goes to enroll their kid and they're told, technically there is universal pre-K. We still don't have it here.
But we don't have room for you, right? Colin, again, this is one of those kind of bread and butter democratic issues that that a lot of advocacy has kind of developed behind. Talk about why we can't get to the finish line there. It seems like there are incremental changes every once in a while, but not ever getting it done.
I mean, I think the simplest way to put it is universal pre-K is going to be an expensive program for the state. Mm-hmm. This is something that Governor Gretchen Whitmer has mentioned, and I believe her past few State of the State addresses, she's called on the legislature now repeatedly to get it done. At the same time, though, there's only so much money to pay for these types of things. So as Alethia mentioned, this budget did expand that from 300% of the federal poverty guidelines to about 400%. At the same time, it's a matter of finding the money in the budget. One of the things was what we were talking about earlier, this reduction in the school's per pupil funding allowance, or rather the lack thereof increase in per pupil funding and foundation allowances. Some of that money is going to go toward the universal pre-K expansion, the Great Start Readiness Program. At the same time, though, there wasn't enough to finish the job. And this is something where I think, again, Democrats and possibly Republicans as well, there's some support for the idea in theory, but when you actually get down to the nitty gritty details, it's going to take a lot more work than I think lawmakers were able to do.
Again, 313-577-1019 is the number here on the phones. We're talking about the state budget, which got approved last week ahead of that July 1st deadline. Legislators spent all night talking about the various proposals and the various ideas that Governor Gretchen Whitmer had put forth to spend $82 billion on. What do you make of the choices that they made? What do you make of the politics in Lansing with Democrats in control, not just of the governor's office, but also of both houses of the legislature for the first time in about 40 years? How are they doing? How are they doing with expanding opportunity, uplifting the state's most vulnerable populations? 313-577-1019 is the number here on the phones. That's 313-577-1019. You can also go to Twitter and hashtag #CreateItEqual or @WDET, and we can include you in the conversation that way. Okay, I want to go back to the K-12 budget and talk about what some of the consequences might be for the decisions that lawmakers made. Things are pretty tight in a lot of school districts that are used to more flush, I guess, financial circumstances. I mean, in places like Grosse Pointe, for instance, things are pretty tight, and they're talking about shortfalls that they haven't had to deal with in the past. Are layoffs and things that would affect instruction in the classroom on the table? Are these things that Michiganders are going to see happen when their kids go back to school in the fall? Colin, I'll start with you.
Well, this is something where education groups are raising the alarm. They say more needs to be done, and they're really crossing their fingers for a supplemental budget to spend a little bit more towards schools. The Michigan Education Association had released a press release after the budget passed, basically saying that they appreciate the reduction in the retirement contributions. At the same time, they're saying that schools are in trouble. They're saying that they're pointing to some of the deeper cuts in this budget, like to school safety and mental health, which was reduced significantly. And yes, this could have some potential impact. Now, it depends on who you ask. There are some Democrats in the legislature that supported this budget that say it's possible to have your cake and eat it too, that this wouldn't be the same disaster for schools that some school and education advocates are saying it could be. That remains to be seen. But the fact of the matter right now, though, is, and you had alluded to this earlier, Democrats who supported this budget and schools seem to be at odds, at least a little bit, when it came down to the implications this could have.
Alethia, we have this kind of strange system of funding schools in Michigan that we keep saying is going to eventually result in some sort of equity between wealthy districts and poorer districts. It seems that we can never quite get to that space, though, because fundamentally the way we fund schools comes up short, and we have so many pressures on the dollars that we send to schools. But things like legacy costs, pensions for instructors, which is a really important priority too. But the tensions between that and the things that would more directly affect kids in the classroom, it seems like we can't get past all of that to get to this space where we're dealing with a level playing field, I guess, between all districts.
Right. And I think, on the level playing field front, this budget does still try to fund students that they call at-risk students who are a little bit more expensive to educate. And that's what really drives sort of this inequity problem, right? Some districts that are wealthier might have students who are just maybe less expensive to educate, while the poorer districts don't have that same landscape. So there is funding, to increase special education, to increase at risk for students who need more. So they did still, even though there's not a per pupil increase, they did still do that. And I do want to touch on the layoff question too, because that, is incredibly complex. You guys talked about this at the beginning of the show. The last few years, there has been a ton of federal money going into schools, and that, is over. COVID has, at least from the government standpoint, officially ended. So they're not seeing, a ton of extra federal money, and that will have an impact. So even before this budget was finalized, talks of layoffs, were already happening. A lot of districts used this federal money to maybe up staff, whether it was teachers or support staff or things like that, and they just can't really keep it going in some places. So layoffs were already part of the conversation.
Yeah. How much of what we're seeing, not just with schools, but with other kinds of spending, has to do with this federal money that, flooded into Michigan, not just during the pandemic, but over the last 4 years, with things like ARPA and the Inflation Reduction Act, and the fact that we're kind of nearing the tail end of that cash flow, and so if decisions were made to increase fixed costs, for instance, because of that, you've got to find new sources of revenue for those things to be maintained. Is that some of what we're seeing with what schools are dealing with, Alethia?
Definitely. There's just less money to go around. The other change too that particularly impacts schools is, immediately post-COVID, we really saw people spending a lot more on goods, things that, we paid sales tax on. People were paying less on services. You weren't going out as much, and you were buying more things, so you were paying more sales tax. And that really helped school funding as well. We're starting to see people kind of go back to their regular spending pattern where they're not paying as much sales tax. And that is also, while the school aid fund is still growing, it's not growing at the same rate it was during, those peak COVID years. And that's having, an impact there as well.
Colin, what's the sort of, I guess, long-term answer to some of these shortfalls and the fact that this federal money was never intended to be around forever, and that the effects of spending changes and subsidies from the pandemic were just not going to sustain themselves?
I mean, that's the thing. We're seeing in this budget, for example, a lot of the focus has been on this K-12 budget. And I think one of the reasons for that is you don't see a lot of the sexy kind of make it rain type of items that you saw in previous budgets when we did have a lot more federal dollars. So yes, this budget is still a record-breaking budget. It's one of the biggest it's the biggest in state history, but it's the biggest by a lower amount than past budgets were, especially when the federal government, we saw some of these infrastructure dollars or American Rescue Plan Act dollars coming through, the ARPA that you were talking about. So you're seeing lawmakers talk about paying down debt. I haven't really personally heard much discussion or appetite really for the T word taxes when you're when you don't have a lot of extra money just to spend. But I think that's one of the things where lawmakers are going to have to address this problem eventually. And you've seen this concerns being raised by Republicans about irresponsible spending.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take another quick break, and when we come back, we will continue talking about the state budget, a slight enhancement to the description of the money that WDET is going to receive from the state budget. It's $1 million that is going to go toward the WDET Community Broadcast Center, this new studio and public space that we are trying to build here, trying to raise money to build. That $1 million in the enhancement grant from the state is going to go toward that. Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk a little more about economic opportunity and the money that legislators want to spend expanding it. We also want to hear from you, the listeners, on the phones and on social. Give us a call. 313-577-1019 is the number here. You can go to Twitter and #CreatedEqual or @WDET. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. We're We're back with more Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm really glad you've decided to join us. We're talking about the state budget, which got approved last week by legislators in Lansing after an all-night session hashing out spending priorities for the next fiscal year. Alethia Kasben is with us. She is the managing editor at Gongwer News Service in Lansing. Also with us is Colin Jackson. He's a reporter at the Michigan Public Radio Network. We're talking about what legislators decided, how they decided, and how it affects the state's most vulnerable populations, children, people who need more economic opportunity. We also want to hear from you about how much attention you pay to things like the budget process. Awfully important how legislators make priorities when it comes to public spending. Did you take a look at what they did? Did you have ideas about what they should do, the things that they should be spending all of that money on? 313-577-1019 is the number here on the phones. That's 313-577-1019. You can also go to Twitter and hashtag Created Equal or at WDET, and we can include you in the conversation that way. Before we get to listeners, I want to talk about one more area that the legislature made a decision about last week. University funding, spending on higher ed is another area of the state budget that has been the subject of quite a bit of argument over the last 10 or 15 years. We keep slipping behind what other states are investing in that kind of opportunity. Legislators decided to increase university funding by 2.5%, but I'll make this point again. I make it a lot. We still spend more on prisons in the state of Michigan than we do on higher ed, and we aren't really moving toward a flop of those priorities. I think it says a lot about what we value. It says a lot about what we think about opportunity. But 2.5% is not nothing. Alethia Kasben, what do we make of that bump for higher ed? Might it result in things like lower tuition, perhaps, for families who are trying to send kids to college?
It's an increase. It is a smaller increase, but it is, what kind of all parties proposed here. As we have been talking about all show, money is tighter than it's been in years past. So this wasn't, super exciting increase, but it is an increase. And, they did also put $30 million more into the state's sort of scholarship program that they're trying to really bolster behind community colleges and universities. And there was a change there that I think is interesting to sort of cover all costs of attending college. So potentially students could get more financial aid to help with things, outside of just books, tuition, room and board kinds of things. So potentially people could maybe see some more relief, but I think, we have a long ways to go before it's truly affordable for every college student in Michigan.
Yeah. Colin, what do you make of the higher ed priorities that the legislature came up with last week?
Well, one of the things I was looking at was to see whether or not the legislature would continue funding to expand the Michigan Reconnect program. This is a program that provides people, I believe, over the age of 25, currently, at least until the next budget kicks in, over the age of 21, the chance to go back and finish up a degree or an equivalent certificate or training, professional training. And this is something that the last budget temporarily lowered to 21. This budget will send it back up to 25. But overall, this administration has made a point of trying to get more people some sort of post-secondary degree. So I was curious to see kind of where that spending is. And you mentioned prisons earlier. So just to bring that up real quick, I saw that there was money in the budget for prison higher education, which is an interesting component to it all. But at the same time, like you mentioned, though, we're still spending a lot of money on corrections and not as much on higher education.
Yeah. Let's take a phone call here before we move on to some other subjects in the budget. Robert in Detroit, welcome to the show.
Hi. Yeah, you mentioned prisons, and you also mentioned about education and families that are in districts that are well off and don't have as many problems and stuff like that. I think really what we should have is an emphasis on free birth to kindergarten care, because that would give a lot of these families that are having difficulties the freedom to get jobs and not be so stressed out, so they could be better parents. And I think that it should be universal. It shouldn't be based on your income or anything like that. And that would bring people to come to Michigan to want to live, and they would pay more taxes, because when they come here to live, they would have the jobs to put into the system. So I think that would be a really great investment. One other thing is, I think that we should have like a minimum internet service for $30 a month for everyone. And if you want, pay more. But, and if people want to go to private schools or private daycare, let them have at it. But to provide this is kind of like that universal income in a different.
Yeah. Robert, I really appreciate the call. And those ideas. I'm going to start with the childcare idea. There is an increase in this budget for childcare funding to better support families. Let's start with that. What did the legislature do with that, Colin?
In terms of trying to get, I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
Childcare, expanded support for funding childcare costs for families in Michigan.
Well, again, this is something that comes back down to, for example, the Great Start Readiness Program, expanding the universal pre-K. Childcare funding is something that I haven't been paying the most attention to, so Alethia might be better suited to answer that question.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. Go ahead, Alethia.
So, there's some funding in this budget for childcare reimbursement rates. There's some funding, some grant funding for childcare institutions to apply for to get some help. The governor has also been big on this Tri-Share program, which in certain areas, tries to split the cost for childcare between the employer, the provider, and the local government. So there's certainly some things in this budget, but nothing near, universal or like fully paying for childcare institutions. And as anyone with a toddler in childcare knows, it is very, very expensive. It is one of the hardest things for, families to do. It's certainly, I think, something the legislature, would love to chip at, but the idea of fully paying for it, it's just astronomical. It's something other countries do, but it's not something that has fully been embraced clearly in the United States to pay for childcare institutions. So definitely a pie in the sky, I think, idea.
So I also want to touch on something else Robert brought up, which was that he believes if we did some of these things, we would retain more people in Michigan. We might attract more people to live in Michigan. And that, of course, reminds me of the governor's push to, I guess, stop the population slide here in Michigan. And we should be clear, it's not that we're losing population, it's that we're just not gaining it at the rate that many other states are. And so we're kind of sliding down the population ladder, even though we are growing. There's a lot of focus, or there has been a lot of focus in this administration on ways to kind of reverse that trend for us. Are there things in the budget that point toward this population effort and all of these recommendations that we have to make Michigan more attractive? Colin, where should we look in the budget for those things?
So we saw that the governor the budget put some money toward affordable housing. The governor's highlighting $100 million for more affordable housing, even smaller appropriations like a $10 million appropriation for minority-owned business grants. Those have been a source of Republican criticism from some lawmakers in the past. There's also that $45.5 million appropriation to grow the state's workforce through different economic assistance programming, and even smaller things, like we saw like 20% increase for home care workers, different tuition benefits for educators. So these are some things that if you would ask the executive, they would tell you these are things that would help with talent acquisition in the state and talent attraction to make it easier to work and grow a family here in the state. The question is still, though, does this go far enough?
Yeah. Alethia, where do you see that population priority showing up in these budget decisions?
I think in sort of the education realm, the increase in scholarships, increase in financial aid funding, the K through 12 things, even though, as we have said, there was no per pupil increase, there was still, a lot of money thrown around in there. The population report did have, a lot about education and trying to move to sort of a pre-K through 14. And on that front, we also had a revised version of sort of this community college guarantee. So I think, under this budget, most high school graduates from Michigan will see 2 years free community college tuition. Yeah. So there were some things they weren't marketed as, this is going to help population growth. This is coming directly from the population report. We even saw the governor propose more funding toward the work of that council and sort of the state office she's created around population, and the legislature did not go for additional funding for that purpose specifically.
Yeah. I want to talk about some other things that were in this budget that I think really focus on opportunity. There was an increase in basic cash assistance for families with low income, including a shift of TANF funds, temporary assistance for needy families, to the Family Independence Program, and a reduction in some of the lifetime limits on that program. That's a really important shift. The way that we deal with TANF funds here in Michigan, like it is in other states, is pretty fraught. There's a lot of things that are kind of ineffective. This idea of shifting them to kind of direct support for these needy families is a significant decision. Colin, what do you make of it?
I mean, this is something where it's easier. I mean, we've seen different studies suggest that the best way to help people is by giving them the money and allowing them to use it for whatever they see fit the best. Mm-hmm. So like you said, this is a significant shift. This is something that different advocates have asked for. They finally got it. Previously, there were questions in terms, when you have more layers, I guess, in between the money and the recipients, there's more opportunities for that to go wrong. There's more opportunities for that to go towards things that maybe aren't necessarily the biggest need. So, like you said, this is a big change in how the state does aid for families, especially low-income families.
Yeah. Alethia, they also expand RX Kids in this budget, and that's a program that is being developed in Flint to move direct cash payments to families while women are carrying their children, and in that first year after children are born, that critical first year where things like access to healthcare and food and things like that are so important. That's another kind of fundamental shift, I think, in the way that government thinks of its role in terms of expanding economic opportunity and, of course, the social safety net.
Right. I think, between the TANF change and the lifetime limits for cash assistance and sort of increasing that basic there, it was the first increase since 2008, I wanted to note. And then the RX Kids, too, is getting, direct cash to families during, a time that could be, slightly fraught, pregnancy and afterwards. So these are, big deals that advocates, have really supported. Like you said, the RX program was in Flint. You mentioned Monique Stanton at the beginning of the show, the League for Public Policy, which she is the leader of, was really supportive of both of those items and believes that it will help families in Michigan thrive and really help, lower income people here, make ends meet more easily.
Yeah. Again, 313-577-1019 is the number here. Give us a call. Let us know what you make of the state budget and the state budget talks that went late into the night last week. We did end up with an agreement before July 1st, which is when we're supposed to get that. I want to talk about a couple other kind of social safety net things and health care and healthcare access. is another important part of that. There were some investments in access and equity, including waiving the $10 copay for My Child. Alethia, tell us about what that means.
So it just, it ends this payment that families had to make before. So that's $10 more in someone's pocket, more likely to get, medication or treatment that you might need. So another thing that just, helps people that really, every dollar, really counts.
Yeah. Colin, I wonder what you make of this kind of overall shift to thinking about the way to fund anti-poverty programs in Michigan. We have talked about that several times on the show, and there was a lot of hope that this budget would do that. How much of that overall do you feel like they were able to accomplish? And are there things that the governor may, in the future, I guess, have to take another run at?
I think that the budget took some steps toward that goal. I mean, it was something that you'll see Democrats talk about a lot when they praise this budget, is that they'll say budgets are value statements. They say they reflect the values of lawmakers and who's in charge. So when I asked Democratic Senator Sarah Anthony, who's the Senate Appropriations Chair, what's the story of this budget, she said continued investment in people. Some of the big things that I think this budget does and that lawmakers have been working on even outside of this budget, for example, water affordability. This budget includes $10 million to help with water affordability programs. So that's something that's part of the basics. There was original proposals and negotiations to include money for the Michigan Energy Assistance Program to help lower income families pay for their energy bills. There was separate legislation also kind of aimed at increasing some money for different energy assistance funding. So that might happen later outside of this budget. But I think when it comes down to kind of some of those like bare minimum basics, there was the TANF funding that we had talked about. I think that this is a step toward that reshaping how we think about poverty assistance.
Yeah. Alethia, if you're the governor's office or the governor herself, how happy should they be about, again, how much the legislature adopted this, not just the specific proposals, but I guess this change in approach and vision?
I think the governor's office is very happy with this budget. I mean, there are some things that she didn't get that she wanted, of course, but overall, this is very in line with what she proposed in February. There's more money for housing, which certainly is an issue that we've been hearing more and more about. She got what she wanted in the K through 12 budget with the retirement change. So, even though there's some fighting there, it's still what she wanted. So in the end, she won that issue. So I think the governor is very pleased with this.
Yeah. Okay. Alethia Kasben, managing editor at Gongwer News. Really great to have you here as always. Thanks so much for joining us to talk about the state budget. And Colin Jackson, reporter at Michigan Public Radio Network. Great to have you as well.
Happy to be here.
Okay, that is going to do it for us on Created Equal. Come back tomorrow when we are going to hear a conversation I had with someone who spent a year trying to literally live out the U.S. Constitution, the rights and the privileges, the limitations that are spelled out in the Constitution. Had a really interesting and fun conversation about what that can teach us about our history and the rights that we have in this country. Of course, that is happening on July 4th, and we hope that you have a really great July 4th holiday. That's going to do it for Created Equal. Remember, you can listen to recent episodes of the show at WDET.org, and make sure that you subscribe to our podcast, where you can leave us a rating or a review. Created Equal is produced by Carrie Jr. II and David Lines. Our engineer is Nate Bender. Audio editing is by Connor Anderson, and the music is by Sam Bobian. Created Equal is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.